The heat in the Black Ridge district doesn't dissipate at night. It just settles into the timber. I was 22, working my first seasonal contract as a fire lookout for the United States Forest Service at Tower 4. It was an old cedar-shingled cab, mounted 30 feet up on 4 creosote-treated legs, sitting on an isolated granite knob 12 miles past the last paved county road. My setup was standard: a fiberglass azimuth map board in the center of the room, a pair of heavy-duty 7x50 binoculars, a kerosene stove, and a wall-mounted Motorola radio wired to a solar battery bank. But tucked beneath the metal desk frame, covered in thick dust and dry pine needles, was an older piece of equipment. It was a green aluminum PRC-127 tactical radio, heavy as a brick, plugged into an expired lithium pack. I'd seen it sitting there for 3 weeks without giving it a second thought. On July 14th, around 2 a.m., the speaker on that green box clicked open with a static burst. It wasn't the crisp, digital dispatch tone of the regional frequency. It was a wet, analog hum. Then a voice came through, calm, flat, thoroughly professional. Unit 12, if anyone hears this, do not acknowledge this frequency. I stared at the radio. The green LED display was dark, yet the speaker vibrated with power. In the solitude of a midnight watch, instinct took over before logic could intervene. I reached down, keyed the plastic push-to-talk button on the side of the casing, and spoke. "Tower 4, go ahead." Silence. I released the button. The speaker gave a soft, fading hiss, then went dead. I waited 5 minutes, resting my hands on the desk, listening to the wind scrape cedar branches against the guy wires. Nothing happened. I shook my head, feeling a slight flush of embarrassment at breaking protocol for what was clearly an off-gotten test signal or cross-channel bleed, and went back to logging the weather report. 5 minutes later, I took my flashlight and walked out onto the wooden catwalk to take the psychrometer reading. I looked down at the gravel turnaround 50 feet below the tower. My state-issued Ford Ranger was parked there. I knew that truck down to the rust spots, but as the beam of my light hit the tailgate, my eyes locked onto something welded directly beneath the state license plate. It was a heavy brass plaque, stamped with 4 lines of dense, raised microtext. I leaned over the railing, squinting. It had always been there. I had washed that bumper 2 days prior, rubbed my thumb over the exact spot while clearing off dry mud, yet my mind had registered it as a blank piece of flat steel. Now, I could read it clearly from 30 feet away in the beam of a flashlight. Property of D, Department of Interior, Disposition Procrawl, 09B, do not remove under penalty of exclusion. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. The brass didn't look new. It was tarnished, pitted with age, seamlessly bolted into the frame. I looked over at the wooden trail sign marking the trailhead at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't just a directional sign for the ridge loop. Beneath the carved arrow, carved in the exact same deeply weathered font, were 2 additional lines of text. Return before dusk, or remain within a clearing. Register all surname changes before crossing. I had walked past that sign every morning for 3 weeks. My fingers had touched those letters while hanging fire warning posters. I stepped back into the cab, my heart beating against my ribs in a slow, heavy rhythm. Nothing in the forest had changed. The wood was still wood. The metal was still metal. But the veil of my own selective blindness had slipped just a fraction. The next morning, the district assistant came up the mountain in a supply truck to drop off freshwater jugs and propane tanks. His name was Miller, a 12-year veteran with sun-baked skin and a thick mustache. "Quiet night?" he asked, hauling a 5-gallon carboy up the steep wooden steps. "Yeah," I said, watching him closely. I handed him the clipboard to sign off on the delivery. As he filled out his initials, I looked at the brass badge pinned to his green uniform shirt. The brass surface was etched with a long 17-digit serial number across the top edge. As I stared, Miller adjusted his strap, and my eyes tracked the numbers. They were sharp, crisp, and completely different from the serial number I had casually glanced at on his chest yesterday. Yesterday, it had been a standard 4-digit employee ID. Today, it was an alphanumeric sequence that stretched edge to edge. "Miller," I said carefully, pointing at his chest. "Did they issue you a new badge?" He paused, looking down at his chest, then back up at me with an unblinking, neutral expression. "What are you talking about?" "Same badge I've worn since '98. He signed a sheet and handed the clipboard back. I looked at his signature. Beneath his handwritten name, in neat, printed black ink that filled the margins of the official government form, was a column of tiny, dense notations. Observer status. Unverified. Exposure cycle 1. Do not engage regarding land boundaries. He didn't see it. He looked directly at the page, handed me the pen, and smiled. "Get some sleep, kid. You look exhausted." I watched his truck drive down the dirt road. Through the dust cloud, I noticed the topographical map nailed to the wall of the tower cab. I walked over to it. I had memorized this map. I knew every contour line of the Black Ridge district. Now, drawn in fine red ink between the grid lines of Section 14, were 3 large, perfectly square areas marked in dark hatch marks. Printed inside each square were the words, "Non-occupied zone, no recorded rescue obligation." They weren't new markings. The ink was faded, yellowed around the margins, seamlessly integrated under the lamination. The park map hadn't been tampered with. It was the exact same map that had hung on that wall for 20 years. I was just finally capable of reading it. At 14 p.m., while the midday heat shimmered off the granite, the green PRC 127 radio under the desk clicked open again without a flicker from its screen. "Unit 12, confirm visual on the western boundary marker." I sat in my chair, sweating. My hand hovered over the plastic microphone. Every logical instinct yelled at me to step away, to walk down the stairs, get into my truck, and drive out to the highway. But the urge to understand the silent language surrounding me was an itch behind my eyes. I picked up the mic. "Unit 12, visual confirmed." The radio emitted a short, flat tone. Then the speaker uttered a single, harmless sentence. "The trees on the North Ridge do not cast shadows at noon." The signal ended. I stood up slowly and walked out to the northern side of the catwalk. It was exactly 14:05 p.m. The sun was high and brutal. I looked out over the unbroken expanse of ponderosa pine stretching 4 miles toward the river valley. The trees directly below the tower cast long, dark shadows across the gray rock, but as my eyes moved across the ridge line to the north, the area marked as Section 14 on the map, my chest tightened. Hundreds of acres of dense timber stood illuminated in the harsh sunlight, perfectly clear, perfectly sharp. And beneath them, the floor was bright, uniform ground. No trunks cast a shadow. No canopy threw shade. The light passed through the forest as if the biomass was entirely transparent to the sun, while remaining physically solid to the eye. Visitors were hiking that trail right now. I could see 2 small figures in bright jackets walking along the North Ridge path through my binoculars. They were walking through a forest that lacked shadows, stepping over illuminated soil, completely oblivious to the physical anomaly enveloping them. They couldn't see it because their minds refused to translate the missing light. I put the binoculars down. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them. By the 4th day, the radio didn't need to transmit for me to find the discrepancies. Knowledge was acting like a slow, irreversible infection in my visual cortex. I took a walk down to the visitor center at the park base to buy supplies. The small gravel parking lot had 30 cars in it. I stood near the wooden porch, watching a family of 4 eat ice cream on a picnic table. None of them looked at the far corner of the picnic area. I watched as 3 different groups of tourists walked toward the restrooms. Without exception, every single person executed a smooth, subtle arc around a 20-foot circle of open grass near the flagpole. They didn't look at the grass. They didn't slow down. Their bodies simply adjusted their trajectory by 3 feet to avoid stepping into that specific patch of ground. seamlessly continuing their conversations as if the detour was entirely natural. I walked over to the edge of that circle. I looked down. Embedded in the soil, almost buried under grass roots, was a heavy steel hatch, 6 feet wide, stamped with the words, "Removal Site 4. Maintain distance during occupancy." The tourists walked around me, laughing, tossing trash into the bins, completely unaware that their brains were quietly steering them away from an active containment hatch built right into the public lawn. I returned to the tower and sat in the dark. I didn't turn on the kerosene lamp. I sat on the floor with my back against the metal desk frame, staring at the green radio. It was no longer connected to the lithium battery pack. I had pulled the cable 2 hours ago. The thick black wire lay severed on the floorboards. At 22 p.m., the radio spoke directly out of its cold, disconnected speaker. In at 12, acknowledged the sign at the district gate. I didn't reach for the microphone. I stayed on the floor, holding my knees to my chest. "No," I whispered to the empty room. The radio didn't care if I pressed the button anymore. The transmission had reached me. The speaker murmured its final, polite sentence. "The emergency exits in the administrative basement have always been sealed from the outside." The radio went silent. I closed my eyes, but it didn't help. The information had already taken root. In my mind's eye, I instantly saw the floor plan of the district headquarters where I had signed my employment papers 3 months ago. I remembered the heavy gray steel doors labeled exit at the end of the lower hallway. I remembered the thick, rusted exterior deadbolts welded directly across the outer jambs, details I had seen, registered, and instantly discarded as Omeri maintenance. They were locked from the outside to keep whatever was in the administrative files from being carried out into the park. I covered my face with my hands. I couldn't go back to the headquarters building. I couldn't talk to Miller. I couldn't look at the visitors without seeing the invisible boundaries they were constantly dodging, or the extra warnings printed on their park permits in microscopic type that explained what would happen to their belongings if they stayed past the closing hour. I was completely isolated. The world hadn't changed. The trees were still trees. The rangers were still rangers. The park was still a park. But the layer of quiet, bureaucratic horror woven beneath its surface was now fully visible to me, and I couldn't unsee a single line of it. I was a stranger in my own species, living in a space governed by rules no normal human mind was allowed to perceive. On the 7th night, the wind howled through the guy wires, shaking the glass panes of the watchtower. The air inside the cab smelled like hot copper and ozone. The green radio on the floor didn't crackle. It spoke with absolute, terrifying clarity, its tone as clinical and detached as a late-night weather broadcast. "Unit 12, roll call for district inventory." I didn't move. I sat in the center of the room staring at the azimuth board. "Ranger Arthur Vance, status clear," the radio said. A pause. A faint click. "Ranger David Miller, status clear." Another click. "Ranger Elena Rostova, status clear." Name after name poured from the small speaker. I knew these people. I had seen their names on the shift logs, seen their signatures on trail maintenance reports, seen their face shots hanging on the wooden board in the break room at the main station. With every name the voice read, a strange, hollow sensation washed through my mind. It was like watching a line of text being highlighted and deleted from a document. I pulled out my wallet with trembling fingers and withdrew my laminated employee card. I looked at the emergency contact list printed on the back. As the radio pronounced each name, the black ink on my card faded. The letters didn't sneer. They simply thinned, dissolved, and vanished into the white plastic, leaving smooth, blank surface behind. Ranger Marcus Thorne, status clear. The name Thorne vanished from my card. I knew with absolute certainty that if I drove down to the station right now, his locker would be empty, his truck would be gone, his file in the filing cabinet would be a blank folder. Every record of his existence within the Department of the Interior had just been systematically scrubbed, leaving only the empty space where his body had been. The radio paused for 3 long seconds. The speaker emitted a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards, settling into the iron frame of my bed. Ranger Daniel Wright. My name. The voice did not state my status. It did not say clear. It waited. The silence inside the cab was total. The wind outside seemed to drop to nothing. The forest sat in absolute, suffocating darkness. Then, the radio asked its final question. Are you still listening? I looked at the window. Reflected in the dark glass was my own face, but beneath my eyes, etched into the skin of my collarbone in fine, crisp white lines of text that had never been there before, was a string of 17 serial numbers. I didn't answer with my mouth. I didn't reach for the microphone, but deep down, in the quiet, ruined core of my mind, I acknowledged the truth. I understood the park now. I saw every boundary, every sealed hatch, every unmapped zone, every hidden instruction stamped into the soil. I was listening, and as the thought crossed my mind, the glass reflection in front of me began to blur. 3 weeks later, the mid-season replacement ranger drove his state pickup up the rocky switchbacks of Forest Road 402. His name was Hayes. He had his duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a fresh thermos of coffee in his hand. He unlocked the wooden door at the base of Tower 4, carried his gear up the 30 steps, and pushed open the cab door. The tower was clean. The azimuth map was wiped down. The bed was neatly made with hospital corners, and the kerosene stove was cold. Tucked under the frame of the desk, sitting in the dust, was an old olive drab PRC 127 radio. It wasn't plugged into anything. Its casing was scratched and discolored with age. Hayes set his thermos on the desk and unzipped his bag. As he did, the speaker on the old green radio gave a sudden, sharp burst of static. A voice came through, raspy, dry, completely exhausted, but speaking with a quiet, desperate authority. Please, don't answer this frequency. Hayes stopped. He turned around, looking at the box on the floor. He frowned, stepping toward the desk. He reached down, his fingers hovering over the heavy plastic casing, curiosity overcoming the quiet caution of the empty wilderness. Down at the main district office, 20 miles away, the administrative assistant was updating the wooden employee board in the lobby. She took a fresh, glossy photograph of Ranger Hayes and pinned it into the open slot under Tower 4 lookout. Right next to it, in the frame labeled Previous Shift, was a photograph that had been hanging there for 3 years. The photo had been fading for weeks, the colors washing out under fluorescent lights until the paper was almost entirely white. Now, as the radio in Tower 4 crackled again, the white paper finalized its transformation. A new image developed quietly in the chemical emulsion. It showed a young man sitting inside a dark lookout cap. His face was turned slightly away from the daylight, staring directly into the camera lens with wide, unblinking eyes that contained no surprise, no anger, and no warmth. In his right hand, held tight against his chest, was a green military radio that the search party had never been able to locate. The Flathead National Forest spans 2.4 million acres of spruce, granite, and glacial river valleys along the Bob Wilderness border in western Montana. When you join a volunteer search and rescue ground team out of Hunger Horse, you sign a 3-page liability waiver, purchase your own high-visibility gear, and learn to read terrain through a grid map. You are taught that missing people are predictable. They follow water downhill. They look for game trails. They build shelters under blown-down timber when the snow starts. In October, we were called out to locate a 34-year-old seasonal wildlife technician named Marcus Lind. He had gone into the South Fork district to collect hair samples from grizzly hair snag stations and failed to check in at his drop point by 18 p.m. on a Friday. The weather was holding at 38 degrees, but a blue, cold Canadian front was moving south over the border. We had roughly 36 hours before the mountain passes were capped in 6 inches of hard-packed ice. Our team leader was a retired state trooper named Vance, a tall, quiet man with sun-cured skin who wore a grease-stained wool cruiser jacket and carried an old leather-bound field book in his canvas pack. Vance didn't talk much on the drive up Forest Road 38. He just watched the lodgepole pines pass in the headlights, smoking unfiltered cigarettes with the driver's side window cracked an inch. We parked at the trailhead turnout at 5:30 a.m. There were 4 of us: Vance, 2 college-age trail crew guys from Missoula, and myself. "Standard sweep," Vance said, shining his mag light down on the gravel as we pulled our packs from the truck bed. 30-yard intervals. Keep your eye on the ground, but check the lower branches. People in shock like to strip their clothing or tie things off to mark where they sat down. We use orange surveyor's tape. If you find something, don't touch it. Call it in on Channel 4. He handed each of us a roll of high-visibility neon orange vinyl tape and a black permanent marker. We unholstered our GPS units, set our bearings, and stepped off the dirt shoulder into the thick timber of Dead Horse Basin. For the first 2 hours, the search was textbook. The woods were quiet, damp with heavy autumn frost that made the larch needles slippery under our boots. I moved along my grid line, keeping the second team member 50 yards to my left, periodically calling out Marcus Lynn's name into the dark timber. My voice bounced off the granite outcrops and died in the brush. At 8:15 a.m., the sun cleared the eastern ridge, throwing long gray shadows through the pine trunks. I was stepping over a rotted hemlock log when a flash of bright color caught my eye 30 feet up a gentle slope. It was a strip of orange vinyl flagging tape, tied in a double knot, around a low-hanging subalpine fir limb. "Vance," I called out over the radio, keying the hand mic on my shoulder harness. "I've got flagging tape on the west flank of the draw. Checking for trail markers." "Copy," Vance's voice came back, flat and dry through the speaker. "Identify the knot." I walked up this slope toward the branch. The orange plastic was bright, but as I reached out to touch it, my fingers paused. The vinyl wasn't soft or flexible like the fresh roll hanging from my belt. It was stiff, faded to a chalky peach color on top, and cracked along the edges from years of sun exposure and winter frost. I turned the tag over to look for handwritten tracking numbers, printed along the bottom edge of the vinyl, in tiny, black, factory-stamped lettering were the words, "Property of USFS, Search Grid 09, dated October 14th, 2014. I frowned, tracing the stamp numbers with my fingernail. A 12-year-old search flag. I looked up the slope. 50 yards further into the thick timber, sitting at the exact same elevation, was another strip of faded orange tape fluttering in the light mountain breeze. Beyond that one, another. They formed a straight, deliberate line that angled sharply away from the creek bed, leading up toward a sheer, impassable cirque of crumbling shale where no lost hiker will ever logically walk. I keyed my mic. "Vance, I'm looking at an old flag line from 2014. It runs north-northwest toward the head wall." There was a long pause on the channel. I could hear the faint, rhythmical crunch of Vance's boots over dry gravel through his open mic before he keyed off. "Disregard the old lines," Vance said, softly. "Stay on your grid bearing." "It's laid out in a search pattern, Vance," I said, stepping closer to the second flag. "It looks like a sweep line." I said, "Disregard it, kid," he replied. His voice hadn't raised an octave, but there was a cold, dense weight behind the words that made me stop with my hand inches from the tree bark. "Maintain your 30-yard interval." I didn't turn back to my original bearing. The forest was too quiet, the floor covered in an undisturbed layer of needle cast that hadn't been stepped on in years. I kept moving parallel to the old line of faded orange flags, watching them slice through the timber like a neon fence. At 11 a.m., the flag line led me into a shallow rock shelter formed by a shelf of overhanging granite. The wind couldn't reach under the ledge. The soil inside was dry, powdery dirt, mixed with dried rotted droppings and old pine cones. Sitting on a flat slab of rock in the center of the dry dirt was an external frame backpack. It was an older model, a heavy blue canvas pack with aluminum stay rods. It wasn't knocked over or torn apart by animals. It was standing upright, lean-to style against the rock, with the shoulder straps neatly tucked beneath the frame. Next to it sat a pair of cracked leather work boots, a half-empty plastic water bottle, and a small, yellow weatherproof field notebook. My heart gave a long way to be seen, bread and flat. Those mornings whine. I said into the radio, my voice dropping an octave. I found a pack, Sector 4, inside a rock shelf 50 yards off the creek. Silence on the line. I didn't wait for a reply. I stepped under the granite ledge, leaving deep boot prints in the dry silt, and knelt beside the gear. The blue canvas was covered in a fine layer of gray dust, but the zippers were intact. I reached out and opened the top pocket. Inside was a driver's license, inside a clear plastic sleeve. I pulled it out. The face staring back at me from the laminated card belonged to a man with dark hair and a short beard. The name printed next to the photo read, Marcus Lind. I took a slow breath, my thumb resting over his name. He had been here. He had taken his boots off, set his pack down, and sat in this shelter. Then I noticed the item resting underneath the notebook. It was an official Department of the Interior Evidence and Property Tag Form, DI-105. It was made of thick, yellowed cardstock, reinforced with a brass eyelet, and wired directly through the zipper pull of the backpack's main compartment. The ink on the card was faded black ballpoint, written in a neat, professional block print. ITM number 04, recovered from Sector 09, case file, number 2018-883-FLATATE, AD date of incident, OCTAT 12-2018, Officer Vinci T. State Trooper, WRE. I stared at the tag. The paper was dry, brittle, yellowed around the brass eyelet. Marcus Lind had been reported missing 3 days ago, October 2026. Yet sitting in my hands was an official agency evidence tag, signed by our current search lead, declaring Marcus Lind's backpack recovered from this exact spot 8 years in the past. My thumb began to shake. I picked up the yellow notebook. The pages were dry and crisp. The final entry, written in the same handwriting as the signature on the driver's license, contained only 3 lines. 10:12. Vance said the road down is closed for weather. 10:13. They brought me up to the shelf. The flags are already tied. 10:14. Waiting for the line to clear. Find anything? I jumped, dropping the notebook into the dust as I spun around. Vance was standing 10 feet outside the overhang, silhouetted against the bright, overcast sky. He wasn't carrying his pack. His hands were tucked deep into the pockets of his wool cruiser jacket, his hat pulled low over his forehead. He looked at me with an expression that was entirely blank. No surprise, no concern, no urgency. Vance. I stammered, pointing a finger down at the blue pack. What is this? This is Lind's gear. There's a tag on it. Your name is on it. Vance didn't look at the backpack. He looked past me, staring at the sheer granite wall behind the shelf. The Park Service manages 2.4 million acres in this district alone, Vance said quietly. His voice was steady, almost meditative, carrying over the faint whistle of the mountain wind. Do you know how many people walk into these trees every year and just stop checking in? Vance! The date on this tag says 2018, I said, my voice rising. Lind went missing on Friday. Marcus Lind didn't go missing on Friday, Vance said, taking one slow step toward the ledge. Marcus was logged into Sector 9 8 years ago. His file was processed, the record was filed. He's alive? I asked, a wave of cold confusion washing over me. Where is he? He isn't anywhere, Vance said simply. When a file gets opened in District 9, the protocol doesn't clear until the search grid is completed, but the search grid never completes because the sector doesn't exist in the public survey. You can't leave an unmapped zone once you're written into the log. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his leather field book. He flipped it open with one hand. Inside, pinned to the yellowed ledger pages, were dozens of small, square driver's licenses, each one tucked under a plastic strap, each page stamped with a black evidence number and a line of tiny, faded coordinates. Every 6 or 7 years, someone stumbles across an old boundary marker, Vance continued, looking down at the pages. They see the tape, they follow the line, they think they're looking for someone who got lost yesterday. They don't understand that the line was drawn to keep the record clean. I backed away until my shoulder pressed against the cold granite wall. You're lying. I saw his family at the ranger station yesterday morning. His wife was sitting on the porch. Vance closed the field book with a soft snap. That wasn't his wife, Vance said. That was an administrative monitor from the regional office in Denver, verifying that the regional search team had mobilized on schedule. He pulled his hand from his pocket and held up his handheld radio. He clicked the selector knob twice, switching to the primary emergency dispatch channel. District Dispatch, this is Search Lead Vance, he said into the mic. Go ahead, Vance. The female dispatcher's voice cracked back, clean and bright through the speaker. Grid sweep for Sector 9 is complete, Vance said, his eyes fixed on mine. Primary target Marcus Lind remains unrecovered. Conditions deteriorating. We are terminating search operations and clearing all personnel from the basin at 12:30. Copy that, Vance, the dispatcher replied instantly. Log updated. Sector 9 officially redesignated as unrecoverable hazard terrain. All active records cleared. Good work out there. Vance, wait, I shouted, stepping forward out from under the ledge. Vance didn't answer. He turned on his heel and walked calmly back down the slope toward the timber, his boots making a quiet, steady crunch in the frozen gravel. I pulled my own radio from my shoulder strap, switching the dial back and forth, pressing the push-to-talk button until my thumb went numb. Dispatch, this is Searcher 2. I'm still in the basin. Do not close the sector. I'm with Search Lead Vance. The speaker emitted a long, flat hiss of static. Then a mechanical, automated voice broadcasted over the emergency channel. Frequency 154.280 is currently unassigned. Please check your regional frequency index. I dropped the radio. It swung from its chest lanyard, bouncing uselessly against my jacket. I turned and ran down the slope, plunging through the pine branches, following the broken line of fresh boot prints Vance had left in the frost. Vance! I screamed into the trees. Vance! The woods were silent. I reached the bottom of the draw where we had stepped off the trail 5 hours ago. The gravel turnout was empty. There were no tire tracks in the frozen mud, no oil drips on the gravel. The wooden trail sign at the head of the path was covered in a thick layer of gray lichen that looked decades old. Nailed to the center of the wooden post was a small, brass surveyor's plaque, tarnished and green around the screw holes. Printed across the face in raised metal letters were the words, Flathead National Forest, Sector 09, closed to public record, under Executive Order 104. Tied around the base of the signpost was a strip of bright neon orange vinyl tape. It was tied in a tight double knot. The plastic was fresh, flexible, smelling strongly of cheap synthetic dye. I reached down with trembling fingers and turned the tag over. Written along the length of the orange plastic in black permanent marker, in Vance's neat, professional block print, was my own full name, my emergency contact number, and the date, OCT, October 12, 2026. Below it, stamped into the vinyl in small factory letters, was a single sentence. Do not follow this line. I didn't freeze in that valley. I walked. I walked south for 14 hours along the dry riverbed, following the flow of the water, because that was what the training manual told you to do when you were lost. I didn't stop for food. I didn't stop to rest. I walked until the trees gave way to the high chain-link perimeter fence of the Hungry Horse Dam complex, where a night security guard found me sitting on a concrete barrier near the spillway at 3 a.m. I didn't tell them about the backpack. I didn't tell them about Vance. I told them I had gotten separated from my hiking group, accepted a ride from a passerby down to the highway, and went home to my apartment in Kalispell. 2 weeks later, I packed my truck, resigned from the volunteer search organization, and moved 3 states away to a low-lying desert city in Arizona, where there are no timber lines, no fire lookouts, and no federal land reserves within 50 miles. I haven't set foot on public land since. Last winter, I was walking through the lobby of a regional government building in Phoenix to renew my vehicle registration. Hanging near the front doors was a large glass display case containing seasonal public notices, fire danger warnings, and safety brochures for the nearby Tonto National Forest. I stopped in front of the glass. Pinned to the wooden backing board, tucked right behind a printed brochure titled "Know Before You Go," was a small strip of faded, chalky peach surveyor's tape. It was stiff, brittle, yellowed at the edges. And as I stood there under the humming fluorescent lights of the municipal building, watching people walk past me with their paperwork and coffee cups, I saw my name written across the faded vinyl tag in dry, cracked black ink, and beneath it, a fresh date stamped in bold, dark print that matched tomorrow's morning calendar.